Hey, I'm Pete for Film Productions and welcome back to another episode of our How to Make a Showreel From Scratch video series. In the previous episode we discussed how to film something outdoors. Today we are filming indoors, so let's get started. When filming inside, sometimes you can still use only natural light during the day, especially if you are close to a window. If this is not the case, you will have to light the scene, which means that you have to control light and shadows. And that's what cinematography is all about, and as I mentioned before, it's a way too big of a subject to cover it properly in this series. That's years of learning. Here I will cover some of the very basics. In this first part I will talk about the type of lights, and in the next episode I will show you some basic lighting techniques. And if you are interested in learning it more in depth, there are literally thousands of really great tutorials out there. I put some of my favorite YouTube channels in this topic in the description below, but now let's talk about the type of lights. There are different types of lights based on the actual light bulb. It can be incandescent, halogen, fluorescent and LED. There are differences in the color temperature. They can be daylight or tungsten balanced and pretty much anything in between. There are also differences in the quality of the light, whether it's hard light or soft light, spectacular or diffused, directional or bounced. Now it's important to understand these differences as they all have different effects. Now let's start with the light bulbs. Incandescent and halogen lights are very similar. They are both tungsten lights that are looking really good on skin. On the downside, they are quite harsh sources and tend to get really hot really quickly. Fluorescent lights are pretty much the softest light source without any modifier. Normally they are daylight balanced, but there are other options as well, and they produce about 75% less heat than incandescent and halogen bulbs. It's probably the best option to create a very natural looking soft light. Finally, LEDs, they are not as soft as fluorescent but also not as harsh as halogen lights. It's somewhere in between. They either daylight balanced or bicolor that allows you to shift the color temperature throughout the entire spectrum. Probably this is the most versatile option. Most of the LED panels can be battery powered, so it can be used in remote locations and it doesn't really get hot at all. When using LEDs, it's important to use one that has a high CRI number. I would recommend 95+. CRI stands for color rendering index. Basically, the higher the number, the more accurate the colors will be. Color temperature wise, the two main options are daylight and tungsten balanced, but it's very easy to shift the temperature of any light using color gels. The two most common used gels are CTB and CTO gels. CTB stands for color temperature blue. It's also known as a daylight filter that turns any tungsten balanced light into a daylight balanced light. CTO stands for color temperature orange that turns any daylight balanced light into a tungsten light. There are also tons of other gels available like green, yellow, red, moon, really you name it. Now in terms of softness, it really depends on the scene, but normally when you illuminate faces you want a more natural soft light rather than a hard light. Now the softness of the light doesn't really depend on the light bulb, it depends more on the size of the light source, light modifiers and the entire lighting setup itself. Firstly, the bigger the light source relative to the subject, the softer the light will be. A big softbox will produce a softer light than a small lamp. Also, the size is relative to the subject, which means that the distance will matter as well. The sun is the largest light source we can possibly use, but it is so far away that its size relative to us is really small. That's why a harsh direct sunlight is a very hard light that creates very bright highlights and very sharp deep shadows. Diffuse light is also softer than spectacular light, so you can soften the light by diffusing it using diffusion sheets or other diffusers, but even a shower curtain is a quite great and popular option. Lastly, reflected or bounce light is a lot softer than directional light, and you can combine these. My favorite setup for a soft light is to put really any type of light into this umbrella softbox, so the light is both reflected and diffused, and the light source itself is now quite large, creating the softest light possible. So what lights and modifiers to get? Again, it really depends on what effect you want. I will show you my lights and what they do, so that hopefully can give you some ideas. Firstly, I got a couple of these redheads. These are 800 watts dimmable, which is always a nice function. These are very harsh halogen lights which tend to overheat and even occasionally blow up, so I rarely use them anymore. If I do so, I would only use it as a backlight. For that, a harsh light like this is completely fine. If I were ever gonna use it as a main or key light, I would only do so with some sort of modifier like a softbox or diffuser, or as a bounce light. Next, I got this compact fluorescent light unit. It comes with a softbox with double diffusion. This particular model has 5 individually controlled bulbs in there, which is really great. The only downside is that it takes quite a lot of time to assemble. Finally, we got some LED panels here. All of them have 1200 daylight balance LED diodes in there. Now, a lot of people like to use bicolor LEDs. I personally don't like them because the way how bicolor LED panels work is that half of the diodes are daylight balanced and the other half are tungsten balanced, and you can control how much of each you want to use. That means that if you want to use either full daylight or full tungsten, which I would normally do, you end up using only half of the diodes, which means a lot less power. If you want to use its full potential, you would have a color temperature of around 4400 Kelvin, which I can't really see myself using. So I decided to go with the full daylight panel that comes with this magnetic CTO adapter, which I can just put on like this. Now with that, I'm still losing some of the output, but not as much as using only half of the diodes, so it works better for me. Now these panels, just like most of the LEDs, can be both DC and battery powered, and it comes with this remote control, so I can adjust the intensity of the light from both behind and front of the camera without actually having to go too close to the light. Lastly, I got these small LED panels. These are really cheap and also extremely useful. It's very lightweight, so it can be placed literally anywhere using just these magic arms. Now, if you're not a professional DP, have no lights whatsoever, and just looking for something to improve the look of your showreel scenes, I would personally recommend to get a softbox kit. There are some really great affordable options available. It normally comes as a full package with boom and light stands and everything, and that will provide you the most natural, even soft light that will work nicely for most of the scenarios. But that's it for now, the very basics of the light. Thanks for watching, I hope you found it useful, and I will see you next time when I show you some basic lighting techniques.